Hey everyone, Team Standing for Truth, updating you on Carbon-14 evidence for young Earth creation. Buckle up, evolutionists, you're about to get wrecked.
There are many lines of evidence that limit the age of the Earth. For example, we know that comets cannot last very long. A comet is made up of ice and dirt, and they orbit the sun in an elliptical path. Now, when comets get close to the sun, that icy material gets blasted out into space, meaning comets are getting smaller and smaller. They are losing mass, and we can calculate the rate as to which these comets are being depleted. The data strongly indicates that comets cannot last millions of years. We also know the rate at which magnetic fields decay. And it turns out our magnetic field is decaying. We can measure the decay of Earth's magnetic field. If you were to run Earth's magnetic field back even 60,000 years, it would have been stronger than a neutron star, which is more than enough to rip the atoms of your body apart.
One of the single strongest arguments for young Earth is the decay of the Earth's magnetic field. As you see here, the Earth has a magnetic field, which is critically important to our lives. And we have been able to measure the decay, the weakening, the shrinking of the Earth's magnetic field for 200 years. Based on solid scientific data, we know that the Earth's magnetic field shrinks, weakens, decays by 50% every 1,400 years. And that means that if we go forward in time, only a mere 2,000 years, no life would exist on Earth. Simply because when the Earth's magnetic field goes to zero, the deadly radiation coming from the sun would irradiate all life on Earth. God created the magnetic field to protect us from this deadly radiation, among other things. But if we go back in time, we have a similar problem. If we go back in time only a mere 10,000 years, the Earth's magnetic field would be 200 times stronger than today. It would kill all life on Earth. So we are living in a very narrow band of time. God never intended the Earth to last for a long time once it became imperfect. And so the Earth cannot even be 10,000 years old, but that is perfectly consistent with the creation 6,000 years ago. And so the decay of the Earth's magnetic field is one of the single strongest arguments for young Earth, over 300 scientific arguments. It limits the age of the Earth to less than 10,000 years old, totally consistent with what the Bible teaches us. That evolutionists cannot be telling us the truth when they say it is millions and millions years old. It is simply impossible.
The magnetic field, the decay of the magnetic field, I completely agree with you. That is a fantastic line of evidence supporting a young Earth. I've heard some evolutionists, some uniformitarians try and rescue the old Earth by saying, well, maybe the Earth's magnetic field have gone through reversals, and maybe it's not, exponential decay, these types of rescue devices. What are your thoughts about those, Dr. Grady?
They're living in a fool's paradise. Let's think about this for just a second. First, I'll start off with a great truth, and then we'll attack the question directly, okay? First of all, I don't care what you find in science that disproves evolution, particularly things that are linear, say. They will say, oh no, it's curvilinear. And then when you find something that refutes evolution that's curvilinear, they'll say, oh no, it's straight line. That is a great truth. It comes from Dr. Grady's 101 Great Scientific Truths. Now, when we apply that to the decay of the magnetic field, even evolutionists will agree, because they have to, it's fact, we can measure the decay of the Earth's magnetic field as it is occurring today. Everybody agrees it's going down in strength. Everybody agrees it was stronger in the past. It'll be weaker in the future. That's fact, and they deal with it. However, they realize that if it decays to zero, it proves them wrong. So what do? They invent a fairy tale for adults. And they say, well, yes, it goes to zero, but it's curvilinear. And so what happens is when it does go to zero, then the poles reverse, north-south reverse. The field is regenerated and then starts to decay again. Now, that's a fairy tale, because let's look at the science of that. Now, everybody in the audience is pretty much aware of MRIs or MRTs, depending upon what country you're in. And magnetic resonance imaging works on people. We stick you inside a big electromagnet. We can visualize what you look like on the inside with the use of a computer and software program. And it's really great stuff. I mean, I've had about 6 or 7 myself. It's a whole lot better than cutting you open. But think about it. It works on the basis of magnetism. Now, if you take the current decay of the Earth's magnetic field, remember it decays the same way a radioactive material decays. It's not straight line. So it decays with a half-life. Now we know the half-life because we've measured it long enough. Remember that we've measured the Earth's magnetic field now for almost 200 years. And we know it has a half-life of 1,400 years. So if you go back in time, every 1,400 years, it's going to double. In the future, it's going to half. Now, if you go back 8 to 10,000 years, the strength of the Earth's magnetic field would be lethal. It would simply kill you. Every single cell in your body would be ripped to shreds. So that means, number one, humans cannot have been on the Earth even 8 to 10,000 years, so we didn't evolve from apes a million years ago. And let's think about this thing about reversal. Now, if the magnetic field goes to 0, we're all going to die because the magnetic field of the Earth causes what's called the Van Allen radiation belts, but it is protecting us from the deadly radiation, primarily solar winds and some galactic radiation as well. But if we don't have it, we'll all be irradiated and die. So if you go forward a while, we're going to die. You go back more than 8 to 10,000 years, we'd be dead. We live in a very short window of time. Next question, second law of thermodynamics. If it went to 0, please tell me by what natural mechanism the field could be regenerated. That's where it's a fairy tale. There's nothing in nature that would rebuild the field. You know, that's asking again to get something from nothing. And so when we take a look at the particulars, the story might sound convincing to those that are not educated or not aware of the science. But to somebody who does know the science, it's an absolutely vacuous argument.
Well, that's a great detailed answer, Dr. Grady, and I love the way you explained it there. And from my understanding, and as you pointed out there, is if we were to run Earth's magnetic field back even just 60,000 years ago, it would have then been stronger than a neutron star, which is more than enough to literally rip the atoms of our body apart. So
well, if you go back 10,000 years, theoretically, you would have what we would call a magnetic star. But of course, life doesn't exist on stars. You don't have to go back 60,000, 10,000, you're dead. And so, again, these ages they talk about cannot possibly happen. And let's take it a little further then. Okay, so if you go back even 8 to 10,000 years, we'll all be dead. And again, if you go forward, say another 14 to 2,800 years, we're all going to be dead. But let's just buy for a second that somehow or another we could survive. And that some mythological way in which we can regenerate the field. Think about the consequences of that. Because what that would mean is that life would have to evolve, all of that life that they talk about evolving in only the last few thousand years, and it would be dead 10,000 years from now. So that means every time the Earth's magnetic field cycled, then we'd have to start all over again. And even they don't believe that.
The magnetic field shields the Earth from cosmic radiations. We know from real-time measurements that I referred to yesterday that the Earth's magnetic field was stronger in the past. A stronger magnetic field meant less carbon-14 production as a result of shielding the Earth from cosmic rays. So if you don't take into effect the Earth's magnetic field being stronger in the past, twice as strong 1,400 years ago, means the radiocarbon production rate was smaller in the past. And so if you don't take that into effect, you're assuming the carbon-14 rate has always been the same. You've already got a problem if you're not taking into account the effect of the strengthening of the Earth's magnetic field.
I could go on, but this video will focus on a really good friend of young Earth creationists. Critics of young Earth creation assert that carbon dating destroys a young Earth. This is rather humorous, considering it is indeed carbon dating that overwhelmingly points us to a young Earth. Radiocarbon is produced in the atmosphere through cosmic ray bombardment, which turns nitrogen atoms into carbon-14 atoms. This circulates into the carbon dioxide that we breathe. It is also taken in by plants during photosynthesis. Carbon-14 gets into our bodies because it gets into animals, it gets into plants, vegetables, and we eat these things. Therefore, if we live, we are taking more radiocarbon into our bodies. What does that indicate for when we die? Well, if we are dead, and since we are not taking in any more radiocarbon, the radiocarbon gets less and less, to the point where there should not be any left. After roughly 90,000 or 100,000 years, there should be absolutely no carbon left. And therefore, if we look to dinosaur bones, or fossilized wood, or diamonds, or any sample assumed to be millions to billions of years old, there should be no radiocarbon detected.
Fortunately, there is a way to put carbon-14 dating to the validation test, where we can see how accurately it can date items of known ages. This is exactly what the British Science and Engineering Research Council did when they conducted an international blind study on carbon-14 dating by sending out artifacts of known ages to 38 of the world's leading carbon-14 testing laboratories. The results? Only 7 of the 38 laboratories produced dates that were even close to the known dates of the artifacts. That's only 18% of the laboratories in this international study. The rest, 82% of the laboratories, produced dates that were across the board, being off by even thousands of years.
I took 10 samples with a wide geological range of ages, and so here we can see the samples that were chosen, the different coal seams, the states, the supposed geological ages. So they range from around 34 to nearly 320 million years from coals, different coals around the US. And what happened, they were radiocarbon dated, and they grouped here. The mean age was about 48,500 years, but they all grouped in this 47 to 50,000 years in the amount of radiocarbon. And that was interesting because you think about it. These coal seams that were supposed to be between 34 and 320 million years conventional age all gave a similar radiocarbon age, which would imply that all the trees lived at the same time and died at the same time. Well, from a biblical perspective, they were all pre-flood trees that died during the flood.
In 2003, a group of researchers performed an unusual test on 10 coal samples obtained from Pennsylvania State University. The researchers wanted to see if carbon-14 could be detected in the coal samples. This test might be considered unusual because carbon-14 decays relatively fast and should not be detectable after a maximum of 90,000 years. Yet the coal samples tested came from strata allegedly ranging in the age from 37 million to 318 million years. The laboratory tests were clear. All of the 10 coal samples contained carbon-14 and similar amounts. This seriously undermines the evolutionary dates for the rock strata containing the coal, because the presence of carbon-14 affirms that the coal samples cannot be millions of years old. The results fit nicely with the coal forming from vegetation that was buried in Noah's flood.
Dr. Andrew Snelling collected samples of fossilized wood found in different layers of the geologic record and found detectable levels of radiocarbon in each sample. It turns out we find detectable levels of carbon in coal, oil, fossilized wood, and even diamonds. You can find examples of this in the secular literature. This data strongly contradicts the old Earth model. You rarely find the secularists talking about this.
In the RATE project, well, actually it was done earlier. It was done by an Adventist medical doctor, Paul Guyon. He'd looked in the literature from Radiocarbon, the journal Radiocarbon, and there's another journal which Radiocarbon results are, and a lot of these labs published the results of these experiments where they took coal and oil and limestone and fossils and put them in their instruments to see if there was contamination, and they actually published the results of the radiocarbon, detectable radiocarbon, and we can see that for samples up to supposedly 540 million years old, which is the main fossil record of the flood, we always got measurable radiocarbon, and it was quite significant detectable radiocarbon. So our own research has also confirmed this. For example, research that I started in the 90s, fossilised wood samples from various locations, supposed geological ages up to 250 million years, were all found to have measurable radiocarbon, and therefore radiocarbon ages of only thousands of years, not millions.
Dr. John Baumgartner of the RATE team tested diamonds. Diamonds are perfect to test because they come from deep within the earth. We know that diamonds are made deep down inside the earth, which indicates that these diamonds have not had any contact with the atmosphere. Logically, they should not have any radiocarbon present. These diamonds were tested, and every single one of these diamonds yielded radiocarbon. Dr. Andrew Snelling has pointed out that this data was presented at a conference, American Geophysical Union. This is one of the largest bodies in terms of geologists getting together. A secularist got his own diamonds, tested them himself, and ended up getting the same results as the RATE team. This is repeatable data. This data flies in the face of the secular-based assumptions. Every single rescue device put forth by the critics and skeptics have failed miserably. For one, machine error does not work. Even if you have no sample in the machine, there will be no radiocarbon. And so when you put the diamond or the sample in the machine, you get detectable levels of radiocarbon. Therefore, this is not machine error. There can be no contamination. The secularists have no answers. We find samples all throughout the so-called fossil record that have detectable levels of radiocarbon. In regards to diamonds, over 10 times the detection limit. Remember, carbon decays so quickly that, let's say, if every single atom in the universe was made of carbon, it would all decay within 1 million years easily. What about contamination? It's flabbergasting that anybody would actually still use this rescue device. The laboratory applies very strict pre-treatment protocols that involve harsh washings, repeated harsh washings in strong acids. These acids will dissolve anything, and these samples are hit with multiple treatments that ensure only carbon intrinsic to the sample ends up in the instrument to be measured. These samples cannot be contaminated, and this is a weak rescue device.
As soon as people started lampooning the results of the research that I was doing on ancient fossil wood samples, I only had to point them to the treatments that the laboratories had given, that it couldn't be possibly contamination, it was radiocarbon intrinsic to the samples. To test their instruments, they analysed samples that were supposedly radiocarbon dead, that shouldn't have any They chose samples of coals and fossils, but every sample contained detectable carbon-14. Even empty sample holders yielded a 0 result. So they should have concluded that the carbon-14 in the coal and fossil samples were intrinsic. In other words, the samples weren't millions of years old.
The carbon must be intrinsic to the samples. Samples of coal, fossils, including fossilized wood, and even diamonds, all have shown to have detectable levels of radiocarbon in them. This refutes the millions of years paradigm. Lastly, the claim that there is other nuclear material down where the diamonds are that can supposedly recharge the C-14 does not work. The RATE team investigated this so-called explanation, and they estimated that you would need 13,000 times more nuclear material in the nearby rocks in order to adequately recharge the C-14. You would need far too much material to recharge, unrealistic amounts, deep down in the earth. Cosmic rays cannot reach deep in the earth, and therefore C-14 should just decay away.
You mentioned carbon and how carbon is found in diamonds, coal, fossilized wood, I believe as well. Have you personally, have you been convinced, or have you seen any good rebuttals to why that is?
The best I've seen, and it won't work, the best I've seen is that there's other nuclear material down there that can recharge the C-14. But the RATE group looked into that, and they estimated that you'd need 13,000 times more radioactive material in these rocks than is actually found there in order to adequately recharge the C-14. And when I recently debated Hugh Ross, that he thought that was the answer, and I pointed out to him, no, you need far more nuclear material. See, the idea is, so C-14 decays quickly. C-14, we find it in diamonds, we find it in coal, and these are buried deep down in the earth, because normally the way C-14 is made is in the upper atmosphere. When cosmic rays strike, they cause a cascade that transforms nitrogen into C-14. But deep down in the earth, the cosmic rays can't penetrate that far. They can't go very far into the earth. They're very high energy. They can't go deep into the earth. And so the idea is that C-14 that's in anything that's deep down should simply decay away. And the half-life of C-14 is 5,730 years. So it doesn't take millions of years for this stuff to decay away. And the idea is that the secularists have proposed that perhaps radioactive material could create the free thermal neutrons that could then create new C-14 in these substances, recharge them. That C-14 that's turned into nitrogen, turned back into C-14. But the problem is the rate of radioactive decay of these other substances is much slower than the rate at which C-14 decays. And so a typical element might be, say, 100,000 times slower than C-14. So you get C-14, boom, boom, it's emitting 100,000 conversions in the time it takes this element up here to turn once. And potentially one of those could recharge one of the nitrogen atoms back into C-14. But that's not going to work, because these things are popping off like this, and then every now and then one of them gets recharged. That's not going to help. That's not going to keep it supplied with such a vast quantity of C-14 that we do find in these things. And so you'd expect in order to have some kind of equilibrium where the C-14 is continually recharged, the amount of other nuclear material would have to be greater in proportion to carbon, roughly relative to their the ratio of their half-lives, which is enormous. It's a factor of 1 million or so, depending on the element. So it's not going to work. There's no way you can recharge that deep down. I think the reason some people assume that that's happened is because I think they found evidence that places that have extra nitrogen, you also find more C-14 there. But that's a prediction of the RATE research group, because if you have accelerated decay, that will happen, because with accelerated decay, that uranium can decay into lead much, much more quickly. And we think that the longer half-lives were shortened by a much greater ratio than half-lives that are already short. Like carbon-14 probably wouldn't have been affected very much by accelerated decay. And so that is going to do it, but it's only going to do it during the flood year until the accelerated decay shuts off, and then it's not going to happen anymore. So other than that, I haven't seen any good answer to the evidence for the fact that we find C-14 in just about everything that has carbon in it, in contrast to what you'd expect if the Earth were billions of years old.
Deep time proponents have failed to account for why radiocarbon is found in samples claimed to be millions and even billions of years old. Given the fact that radiocarbon lasts less than 1 million years, the evidence points to young Earth creation and refutes the deep time paradigm.
All the strange words make sense.
These coal samples carbon date to be between 40 and 60,000 years, but they are sandwiched between geological layers that are supposedly 34 to 318 million years old. So, which age are we supposed to believe?
I hope you enjoyed this video. Please make sure to hit that like button. It really does help. This is Matt Man. Until next time.